Welcome to the Rich Report, a podcast with news and information on the world of startups. Today, my guest is from Panel Logic. We have Parmeet Chadha, who's the EVP of Products and Technology at the company. So welcome to the show, Parmeet.
Hi, Rich. First of all, thanks for having me on the program. I am essentially going to be covering PanelLogic's proposition for virtualization of the desktop, specifically our zero client architecture and technology.
Okay, great. Well, Parmeet, I have your slides up, so why don't we start with that, and we'll follow with a Q&A.
Sure. So let's start with a quick overview of PanelLogic as a company. Company has been around for about 5 years now. We are based here in Redwood City, California. We have a significant operation for EMEA as well, based out of Munich, Germany. Supported by really blue-chip Class A investors, which includes Foundation Capital, Goldman Sachs, and Mayfield. Company has been performing extremely well. We have been getting very good traction, doubling our revenue for the last couple of years. More than 250 channel partners at this point of time, in excess of 1,000 customers, and almost 100,000 Zero clients deployed out there in production. Zero client being our hardware device product that I'm going to talk about in a minute here. Other interesting development for the company over the course of last year or so has been our growing relationship, OEM relationship with Fujitsu, which has taken our zero client technology and actually embedded that in their monitors that they are positioning as zero client monitors for desktop virtualization. Company has received a lot of accolades. For instance, eWeek's Analyst Choice product for 2011 was Panel's product. And certainly, as you can see, we have pretty significant broad-based traction with the customers across a whole series of verticals, which include education, healthcare, small local and state government, some financial institutions. So it's a fairly broad-based traction we've been getting with our product. So with that introduction, let's dive right in. Let's move on to the next slide, which is slide number 3. If you look at desktop evolution, it's been actually a very, very interesting journey. Certainly, we are very much familiar with our personal computers, something that we have used for business productivity as well as personal purposes, both for information creation as well as accessing and using information for the last many years. PCs have really evolved quite a bit, both in terms of compute capability as well as the functional footprint over the course of last 10 to 15 years. So what defines a PC really is that you have essentially a self-contained device which has the data, the application, all of the management of these applications, all the drivers, and an operating system such as a Windows operating system or a Mac operating system and so on. All of these are contained into one single hardware device, which is deployed on a user's desk, and hence the desktop personal computer. However, for last 10 years or so, there has been a growing recognition and realization that from an IT perspective, management of a personal computer can be quite taxing and quite painful, especially if these personal computers are located remotely from where perhaps the IT personnel are. And hence, there have been attempts of starting to what I will refer as movement to the data center of at least parts of the desktop computing. And in that regard, the next evolution that had occurred is to take certain elements of the PC, such as the applications and its management and perhaps even the operating system, and move that into the data center. And that's really what we refer to as kind of the terminal services architecture. A company like Citrix actually developed a lot of their traction in the business by delivering these kinds of products. And then in last, I'll say, 3 to 4 years, there has been a growing recognition that perhaps you can leverage a lot of the virtualization success that the companies have been having on the server side in the data center and be able to leverage these virtualized servers as essentially little PCs sitting in the data center and use the endpoint device, in this case, either a thin client or a personal computer, as nothing more than an access point to these virtualized desktops in the data center. And that's been the next wave of evolution, which is what's referred to as VDI, Virtual Desktop Infrastructure, where you move not just the application and the operating system, you move all of the data as well into the data center, and you completely eliminate any kind of critical data footprint from the endpoint device. And the endpoint device need not be a PC anymore. It could actually be a thin client, which essentially, as we'll discuss in a minute, is more of a stripped-down PC. What Pano is pushing for, and the uniqueness that Pano brings to the table, is to really build upon the notion of a virtualized desktop by saying that it is not sufficient to just move parts of the desktop into the data center and still leave a PC or a thin client as an endpoint device. So in other words, still leave a computing endpoint device. It is critical from Pano's perspective to even move the entire computation, the entire compute power into the data center as well, what we refer to as 100% centralized or radically centralized virtual desktop architecture. And what you deploy instead at the endpoint is a minimal client, what we refer to as a zero client, which really has no CPU, no compute whatsoever, and it simply serves as an access point to the virtual desktop sitting in the data center. So with that, obviously, what Pano is pushing for is extreme level of centralization of compute and centralization of the desktop. And because our belief is that when you do that, from IT perspective, it dramatically reduces the management complexity for desktops, in this case, virtual desktops. Okay. So that what we believe have been some of the waves of desktop computing, and certainly PanoLogic is at the leading edge of this evolution. So let's move on to the next chart, chart number 4. So in order to understand this notion and this evolution we just discussed in a little bit more detail, let's start dissecting what are these endpoint devices that I've been referring to. So let's start with what is a PC. PC really is a bunch of I/O devices, such as a display or a monitor, audio, USB. All of these glued to a bunch of internal components inside a PC, such as the CPU and memory, the hard disk drive, drivers and operating system, and certainly network access and network card. All of these glued together by what amounts to essentially a system bus. Okay, and that's really what a PC is. And this PC is, as I said earlier, is a self-contained device. It need not depend on any external things for data access and so on. It can provide full functional and data footprint to its users, completely serviced by the device itself. However, as you start to consider virtualization, as you start to consider moving some of the footprint of a personal computer into the data center, that starts to bring in the notion of putting some sort of thin client as an endpoint device. So if you move to chart number 5, thin client essentially is, as I said earlier, is nothing more than a stripped-down PC. It still has an operating system, some sort of embedded operating system. It will still have a CPU and memory. It may or may not have a local disk. It will still provide I/O for a whole bunch of I/O devices like USB, audio, and display. And then it basically goes over the network using a network interface into the data center, and it basically collaborates with a server, essentially another computer, which will have the same set of components repeated. It will have compute, memory, a network interface, disk, operating system, drivers, and so on. And so what you see here is that when you virtualize and you still leave a thin client or a PC as an endpoint device, suddenly this architecture is actually using two PCs or two computers to do the job of what was being done by a single self-contained computer on the desktop. So from Pano's perspective, people who are virtualizing the desktop but still leaving a PC or a thin client as an endpoint device, this architecture makes no sense. It's highly inefficient. You've certainly taken the work of one computer and distributed that instead on two computers, but you're still leaving a computing endpoint device and still leaving all of the management burden from an IT perspective for managing the endpoint device. You are still leaving that back on the table or on the desktop, if you will. And that's why we believe that this architecture of leveraging thin clients, leveraging PCs as the endpoint device while you're virtualizing the desktop is not only insufficient, it actually is an incorrect architecture. Okay. So let's move on further to chart number 6. So how is Pano different? So what Pano does is that we obviously move the virtualized desktop onto the virtualized stack in a data center. So whether it's a VMware-based virtualized infrastructure in the data center, or it's Hyper-V or Citrix Xen-based, We are very much we very much support all of these different virtualized infrastructures in the data center. So these virtualized infrastructures in the data center contain the necessary compute, the memory, storage, guest operating systems. It's highly optimized. And what we do is, rather than trying to deploy a computing endpoint device on the user's desk, we simply take the system bus of the backend server and we literally stretch that system bus over the network to the endpoint device, and that endpoint device is what we refer to as a zero client. It has no CPU, it has no software, it has no management burden whatsoever. Essentially, it is no more than an I/O concentrator whereby you can plug in your display, your audio, your USB, and so on into this zero client device. And this zero client device essentially talks to a guest operating system in the data center on a virtualized stack over a system bus. So this is a very, very unique architecture. That's kind of the core invention that the company have had, whereby you move the entire software into the cloud, if you will, and leave no compute whatsoever at the endpoint device. And as a result of that, completely 100% eliminate all the management burden of the endpoint and move all of that burden into a centralized location in the data center. Okay, and still deliver a PC-like user experience to the end users. That's the critical part. So it's not just moving everything back to the data center, but in doing so, you are still delivering PC-like user experience to the end users. Okay. So moving on to the next chart. So if you just kind of drill down a little bit more into this core invention the company have, what we refer to as a system bus extension. As I said, it will move the compute and the OS and all of that into the data center, stretch the system bus over the wire. Now, in order to leverage the system bus effectively and to deliver the right kind of user experience to the end users, that's where the company's sort of secret sauce lies. That's where we have done a lot of innovation in how do you drive high definition video, how do you deliver USB, including USB isochronous support, such as webcams and VoIP calling and things like that. How do you deliver a fantastic PC-like experience in using business applications without actually doing any CPU level compute at the endpoint? And so to that effect, a lot of this intelligence that we have developed is essentially our bus level protocol, what we refer to as Pano Direct Protocol, PDP. This protocol essentially runs on the system bus. It's a level 2 implementation, which guarantees PC-like user experience to the end users without any compute burden on the endpoint device. So if we move on further to chart number 8, this kind of drill down a little bit more in terms of what is the specific definition of what we refer to as a zero client. As is always the case, particularly in our high-tech industry, something very innovative, something very unique comes into the market, and then you will certainly see a whole bunch of pretenders show up as well. And in our case, obviously there is tremendous amount of novelty and disruption with our zero client architecture. And there are a whole bunch of thin client vendors who are now starting to call some of their quote-unquote very thin clients as zero clients, which we believe is nothing more than a marketing jargon from their perspective. Because for us, zero client is a very unique architecture, and it's very much proprietary to PanaLogic. We have patent filed on that. And other folks who essentially are pushing thin clients and calling them zero clients are not really zero clients. The definition of a zero client is very, very strict. First and foremost, it cannot have any kind of CPU in the endpoint device, because the moment you stick a CPU in the endpoint device, you will have software starting to get into that endpoint device looking to leverage that CPU. So in our case, in our zero client, there is no CPU or processor, there is no system memory, there is no persistent memory, disk or SSD. There is no software, there are no firmware updates, and there are no drivers to be deployed. None. That's where the simplicity of our architecture comes into play. That's where the zero management proposition of our architecture comes into play. And since the endpoint device is so minimal, it computes hardly any power. If the device is actually on a full blast, what I mean by that is that it's essentially supporting dual monitor, running high definition video. So it's really leveraging the full capability of the virtualized stack. Even then, our endpoint device consumes no more than 5 watts of power. When it's in a sleep mode, it consumes 0.25 watts of power. So this is orders of magnitude lower than the thinnest of thin clients, and certainly orders of magnitude lower than a PC. Okay, so there is a tremendous amount of power savings. If you put all the other benefits aside, just the power savings actually provide a tremendous return on investment as a result of the zero-ness of our endpoint device. Moving forward to chart number 9, as I said earlier, that we are delivering this disruptive architecture. We are delivering this very, very novel and a simple way of virtualizing the desktop, saving lots and lots of power, and completely eliminating the management burden for IT. However, the value proposition of Pano is not just for IT. As this chart illustrates, we actually have had independent analysts, the Cyril Group, go through and do performance benchmark of our product vis-a-vis thin clients and PCs, and across the board came back with PanoLogic being PC equivalent and significantly better than any thin client out there in terms of user experience. We actually consume a lot lower resources on the back end when you're running these applications, whether it is IOPS and storage or it's compute cycles in a virtualized server. We have one of the lowest memory consumption footprint on the back end, and again, as a result of that, we can actually give a better VM density, or VM being the virtual machine density. And we have the lowest average CPU utilization on the back end for a given user experience and for a given application. All of this translates into much better utilization of the back-end virtualized resources when it comes to performance of our system vis-a-vis thin clients. Similarly, the same group, which is actually accessible and available from our website, will also show you a bunch of benchmarks about how the end user experience shapes up for given applications, whether it's business productivity applications or it's the frame rate for video performance and so on. Our product is performing at the level of a PC and significantly better than thin clients. Okay. So moving on to the next chart. Not only do we disrupt management, we have fantastic TCO proposition for IT, save power. Not only do we deliver PC-like user experience, we also really help the customers have freedom and flexibility in terms of what kind of virtualized infrastructure they want to deploy on the back end in the data center. So in other words, by betting on Pano, our customers do not get locked into either a VMware virtualized infrastructure or a Citrix virtualized infrastructure or the virtualized infrastructure from Microsoft. Since we support all of these offerings, it gives our customers a lot of freedom and flexibility in terms of whose hypervisor and whose virtualized infrastructure they want to deploy in their data center. And the same endpoint device, which is our Pano Zero client, works against all of these different products. On to chart number 11. So all of this amounts to a significantly lower TCO proposition from Pano. Our customers, as I said, there are more than 1,000 production customers now. They are consistently seeing a more than 80% total cost of ownership value by deploying virtualized infrastructure from Pano. And this TCO, as I said earlier, aggregates from no endpoint management, no endpoint security requirements, and consuming almost 97% less power and energy than PCs require, whether it is to run PCs or it is to provide the air-conditioned environment. So a fantastic TCO proposition. Moving on to chart number 12. 100% endpoint security. So since our endpoint has no CPU, no memory, and no persistent memory or data footprint, so the product is architecturally secure. Anybody could walk away with a Pano device. It will be as good as a brick. As a matter of fact, Pano device does not even light up without the necessary back-end software stack in the data center. So architecturally, it's completely secure, 100% data leakage prevention. Also, there are no endpoint security breaches that are possible because there is no software deployed on the endpoint. And hence, again, architecturally, nothing can breach. There is nothing to infect on the endpoint device. We certainly support all of the legislation compliance, whether it's HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley. And then we have a product called Pano Remote, which is also provides you a secure access to your virtualized desktop while you're mobile. Okay, so you deploy a Pano device on the user desk, but then they can also use a remote version of the Pano endpoint while they're mobile and have the secure access to the same virtual desktop that they access from a Pano Zero client. Chart number 13, certainly we have a fantastic proposition when it comes to environment and the product being very, very green. It's a pure hardware device and hence has a very, very long life cycle. Our estimate is 8 to 10 years versus a typical 3 to 5 year life cycle for a PC. We consume very low power, on average about 5 watts of power. And the product is built to actually withstand harsh environments. Very, very small footprint, no moving parts whatsoever. It has been certified to withstand up to 50 degrees Celsius temperature and has no air conditioning requirements whatsoever. So all of this translates into a great proposition for our environment as well when you deploy the PanoLogic product. Okay. So with that, I wrap up my presentation. And once again, thank you for the opportunity to share the Pano story here.
Well, thank you for that, Parmeet. I guess question coming from my side, I came from Sun Microsystems, so how is this solution different than the Sun Ray product?
If you look at the macro level proposition, it's quite similar. I think the core innovation that Pano has brought to the table is this bus extension model that we support. At the end of the day, the Sun Ray is another manifestation of a thin client, versus for us, as said, we have sort of taken that to its one extreme logical conclusion, which is completely eliminate compute, any kind of compute and any kind of data completely from the endpoint. And when you do that, in order to drive the kind of user experience that we are able to deliver, we had to invent this notion of extending the bus of the backend server. And so that's something that is very, very unique to PanoLogic. But at a macro level, the proposition that something like the Sun Ray have been going after is similar to Pano. And quite frankly, it's not very different from what some of the thin client vendors are trying to do as well, which is to virtualize the desktop of the data center and try to reduce the total cost of ownership. It's just that our belief is that ours is a unique architecture and ours is the right architecture for actually taking that to its natural and extreme conclusion in terms of the best possible TCO.
So if you could, for us, Parmeet, could you describe like what the typical kind of client might be or customer for this type of solution?
At this stage of the game, it's typically a IT deployment. IT is the one that is deploying these Zero clients because IT actually has to take responsibility for setting up and delivery of the back-end virtualized infrastructure in the data center. Okay. As far as the deployment of the endpoint device is concerned, there is really nothing involved. You just simply ship the endpoint device and the user plugs that into the network and into their power socket and they're done. Because there is no configuration setup required for the endpoint, but IT does need to take responsibility for whatever goes on in the data center. Now, having said that, the areas where Pano has so far seen traction is a lot of it has been in the mid-market, which has actually been on a faster adoption curve when it comes to VDI or virtual desktops. So that's why I said, educational institutions, healthcare institutions, state and local government, small financial institutions, they are the ones who've actually been latching on to the PanoLogic proposition a lot more than perhaps other segments. And interesting thing is that each one of these mid-market players or these mid-market segments actually has very minimal and sometimes not too sophisticated IT capability in-house. And the fact that they are choosing Pano is actually a testimonial to the simplicity and ease of deployment of the Pano product as well. It really pretty much works out of the box. As a matter of fact, we even have a bundled offering called Pano Express, which also provides you with a backend server appliance with all of the virtualized infrastructure pre-configured and Pano software pre-configured and Windows OS operating system pre-configured, and all you do is plug in the backend appliance into your data center, and then you plug in the Panos on the user's desk, and you're done. So while there is involvement of IT, Pano is actually on the leading edge of also the simplicity story here. And our belief is, if you're just going to give you a peek at the future, as you go forward and as PanoLogic product is able to run on more and more challenged networks and ultimately be able to run on the regular internet as well, my belief is the back-end virtualized infrastructure will actually become more of a desktop as a service, if you will, where just like people are able to access software as a service today, they will be able to access their desktop as a service from third-party vendors and third-party providers. In that scenario, we believe this will start to become a proposition for the small merchant as well. Clearly, right now, the game is mostly being played in the mid-market, and certainly Pano is now also focused on the larger enterprise as well and getting quite a bit of success there.
So, Parmeet, you mentioned the Pano remote solution where the desktop is then forwarded to a mobile device. Could this solution evolve to a point where the smartphone or the mobile device would have your chip in it, and that would become the client talking directly to the data center?
So I think, conceptually speaking, yes. I mean, I think you can draw that logical conclusion that there is a diversity of endpoint devices out there, particularly in the mobile realm, and they should also be able to leverage a lot of the back-end virtualized data center investment to access the desktop, to access the data files, and so on. And at some point in the future, I believe that will come to play itself as well. Again, we are essentially at a certain stage in this journey of moving the compute, moving the desktop, moving the data, moving the management burden all into the data center while the endpoint devices continue to proliferate. Now, in terms of the IP that we have, as I said, right now, one alternate endpoint that the Pano Zero Client IP has found its way into is a monitor, and that's what Fujitsu, our OEM partner, is doing, where they have taken our Zero Client and embedded that into a monitor. Now, at some point in the future, can this Zero Client IP be embedded into a VoIP phone? Could this be embedded literally into a keyboard? Can this be embedded into a mobile device? Absolutely. And that's part and parcel of our long-term journey.
Okay, Parmeet, so you've had this product out there for a while and you've seen a lot of success, but what's the toughest challenge for you as you're out there selling this product? What's the toughest nut to crack?
I think it's for any startup, it's always sort of a innovator's dilemma, right, if you will. There is always something that is entrenched, and for somebody like Pano in particular, with its disruptive proposition, we are trying to disrupt what is entrenched. And when that occurs, there are a certain class of customers which, while they will believe in the Pano story, while they will believe in the notion of virtualizing the desktop, while they will believe in zero client architecture being the right architecture for virtualizing the desktop, it's natural for them to also perceive a high level of risk with that level of disruption. Okay, particularly the risk from end user productivity, particularly the risk from how the end users will perceive and accept something new. And that's essentially is the risk perception that we fight day in, day out in the trenches. We have been getting a lot of success. We have lots and lots of very happy referenceable customers who are growing their footprint with us. And now, having said that, that is something that we need to continue to push forward on. So in other words, this burden of evangelizing something that is disruptive is the key challenge that Pano has been and will need to continue to confront.
Okay, Parmeet. Well, hey, I want to thank you once again for coming on the show today.
Great. Thank you very much for having me to share the Pano story. It was fun.
All right, folks. Well, that's it for the Rich Report. Stay tuned for more news and information on the world of startups.